Tonight on Nation to Nation, 12 First Nations in Northern Ontario have rejected a government offer to settle long outstanding treaty issues.
The Crown did not listen to the evidence and did not listen to the expert reports that were submitted.
As Trump cracks down on illegal migrants, Native Americans are getting caught up in the raids in a case of mistaken identity.
These concerns stem all the way back to World War II. For the longest time, there were Native Americans, especially from our tribe, who were confused with being Japanese citizens.
APTN reporter Karen Pugliese says there are a few reasons why Jaime Batiste has entered the Liberal leadership race.
First of all, he's role modeling. He said himself, somebody has to go first. Before there was a WAP canoe, there was an Elijah Harper, right?
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Treaty annuity payments for 12 First Nations along the shores of Lake Superior in Northern Ontario have been frozen at $4 per member for almost 150 years. Last July, a Supreme Court judge gave the First Nations, Ottawa and Ontario government 6 months to reach a new agreement, but that time has now passed and there's still no deal. Joining me today is one of the chiefs of the affected First Nations, Wilfred King of Gull Bay. Welcome to Nation Nation, Chief King.
Thank you, Fraser.
Okay, so can you first tell our viewers, I know that offer from the two governments was $3.6 billion, but the nations decided to reject it. Can you just tell me a little bit about why they decided to do that?
Yeah, I think it's important for the viewers to realize that the value of the resources that have been extracted from our territory was estimated around $135 billion. And the offer that came in was quite substantially lower than that. We weren't asking for that amount. We made major compromises, but at the end of the day, the Crown did not listen to the evidence and did not listen to the expert reports that were submitted that talked about the value of the resources extracted from the territory.
And I think you were thinking in a number. I think you threw out. I think either to us or another publication I saw somewhere that you were thinking in the area of 135 billion. So sort of around that number.
No, that was the number that our experts had presented at the Stage 3 hearings. That was the value, and it wasn't the total value. There were other important value components to that, but it was what we looked at as something that could be negotiated and something that was real, something that was substantiated, and so forth. And but we weren't never asking for 135 billion. We came down quite substantially from that amount, and but at the end of the day, again, the offer was 3.6 billion at the end of the day from both crowns.
Okay, and as part of that, I guess you were talking to our reporter Karen Pugliese yesterday, I know, in an interview, and you sort of said, told her that the negotiations were doomed to fail from the beginning. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, one of the first things was when the Supreme Court rendered its decision last year in July. We didn't start negotiation. Well, we didn't start the process of engagement until September. And during those 4 months, September to December, we felt that there was no negotiations. It was just one-sided, and we were making our points made, and it wasn't taken seriously. We drew from the evidence of the Stage 3 hearings, and it just didn't go anywhere. They provided an offer in December 2024, and we did not accept that as well. And we thought that, okay, we will engage heavily in January of this year, because we had roughly about 3 weeks to come to an agreement. And again, there was no movement on behalf of both the federal and provincial crowns.
No, that's often been a sticky point and sticking point in some of these negotiations of, the Crown not negotiating in good faith. Is that, and they had that option of presenting a number much lower than, of course, than you'd been looking for at the end of these agreements. Did you think, were they negotiating in good faith, or do you think they had a number set in mind before they went into these negotiations?
Well, I think the number was set in mind. That's my observation. And again, I think my colleagues that were on the negotiating team came to the same conclusion. We were under no illusion that they were going to present a high number or a number that was going to be reasonable. And we felt at the end of the day, our suspicions were correct, that they had no intentions of negotiating in good faith.
Now, I think if I'm correct, you sort of said you're going back to court, but it may not end up being a lot more, or you're not convinced anyway. Maybe I'm misquoting you, but that you may get not about the same amount, but you're still going to go back to court. So maybe why, could you tell us why you're doing that, or?
Because the Crown had exercised its discretion on the money that was offered, we have the opportunity to go before Justice Hennessy, and we're going back in June of this year to ask her to intervene on our behalf and really look at the evidence that's been presented. And we're hopeful that she will raise that offer that was offered by the Crowns, or she may advise us that we should go back to the negotiating table and order all three parties go back to the negotiating table and negotiate a fair and reasonable deal. Or at the end of the day, she might say, well, no, I think this offer was reasonable, and that could be the end of it. Now, both parties could appeal to her ruling, and we're hopeful that she will rule in our favor, that the amount that was offered by both Crowns isn't justified as fair and reasonable.
Okay, fair enough. And also, you covered, of course, the Robinson-Huron Treaty as well. They were able to come to an agreement on that. But I believe this agreement is quite a bit different. Maybe you could just explain to our viewers why that is.
Well, the Robinson-Hurons, we have to keep in mind that the value of the resources that were extracted from the Robinson-Huron territory exceeded $400 billion. And they settled for 10 billion, and that's their prerogative, that's their choice. There were good reasons for that. The Supreme Court hadn't rendered two really important legal principles, and that's the doctrine of laches and the statute of limitations. We took a gamble because we could have lost at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in our favor on those two key legal principles. So where the other parties, they were subjected to uncertainty in regard to that as well. But we took a gamble and we won on those two key principles. I think which is very important. It settles the law in Ontario in regard to that. So.
And is there differences as well in the resources of the two areas of land, or that might be more of value in your particular area, or are they similar in that way, or?
I think the geography would represent that they're similar in value. The issue with the Hurons, a lot of their resources have been extracted, whereas in the Superior region, there is still an abundance of resources that has not been extracted. So we think that as we move forward in future negotiations and annuity payments, that the payment would be much higher for the Superior region.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, but I really appreciate you talking to us today about this very important and interesting issue.
Thank you, Fraser.
Next up, we'll talk to Justin Aasteen of the Navajo Nation about how the Trump administration's crackdown on alleged illegal migrants is affecting Native American people. Welcome back. The media has been flooded in recent days with stories of American Immigration, Customs and Enforcement, or ICE officials, raiding businesses in a search for alleged illegal migrants. It's all part of U.S. President Donald Trump's vow to crack down on people entering the country illegally. But there are also reports of Native Americans getting targeted in these raids. Here today to talk about the issue is Justin Aasteen, who is the Executive Director of the Navajo Nation's Washington office. Welcome to Nation, Mr. Aasteen.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right, so maybe you can first tell our viewers maybe why Native Americans are getting caught up in these raids, and then what sort of numbers have you confirmed so far?
Sure. So I think in areas where some of these enforcement activities have increased is primarily in the Southwest along the southern border. Now, Arizona and New Mexico do share a border with Mexico, and those are probably some of the areas where there is heightened enforcement going on. But what we have also been working with the Department of Homeland Security is making sure that they're educated that not only do these states share a border, but there are also tribes that have been there since time immemorial that also exist in these regions, and making sure that immigration custom enforcement agents have the appropriate knowledge and skill sets to deal with members of these tribes. And these are ongoing discussions. I think it's primarily an educational component that needs to be taken into account. And the Navajo Nation has been receiving reports. Nothing has been confirmed up to this point, but there have been reports from our tribal members, as well as reports to other tribal nations that people have been caught up in these different ICE raids. There was a specific instance in the Phoenix, Scottsdale metropolitan area of a business being targeted. And there, were some indigenous people who were employed at that business. After bringing up the discussions with ICE, we've come to learn that, the tribal members themselves were not the intended target, but kind of got mixed into the crossfire there. But as soon as documentation was provided, they were released. So, these are, again, unconfirmed reports. These are all things that are being handed to us, and we are actively working with the Department of Homeland Security to figure out what some of those best practices are on how we can educate our people and what documentation our people need to have in the event that they may be having an encounter with immigration custom and enforcements.
I guess from what I understand, these ICE officials are mistaking, I guess, Native Americans for Latin Americans, or what that seems to be the problem. But is that not a problem in itself, that people have been indigenous to the land, and so these ICE officials do not have enough knowledge, and so they're basically sort of confronting people that have more right to be on the land than anybody?
It's always been a concern. These are not new concerns, and these concerns stem all the way back to World War II. For the longest time, there were Native Americans, especially from our tribe, who were confused with being Japanese citizens, and we're not Japanese. And I guess as time has evolved and whatnot, that fear has always remained as being treated differently because we may have been profiled, and not saying that profiling in any form is acceptable. But, this is the reality of the situation. And it has been a concern, and it continues to be a concern. But again, that's where we have to work with our federal partners to understand what we need to do to have just to be safe. And that's what we're trying to help bring to their people, so that they understand that the government is taking a proactive step in protecting their interests.
Now, I know up here in Canada, First Nations people are very proud of, and Métis and Inuit also, of their, being the first inhabitants of the lands here. And I know that at times we do have, Canada border officials or whatnot, or officers, and they don't really take kindly. And what I'm driving at is there a potential for conflict here, when you do have officials wrongly accuse the last people that they should be accusing of not being legal?
I would say yes, there's always that potential for conflict, but it's having that collaborative relationship to try to address that and get ahead of the curve, honestly. And that's where I think the nation is moving forward and having these discussions on having, tribal identification that meets the federal requirements that can be easily accessible. Right now, the only way that we can determine our membership is through our certificates of Indian blood, which is, a sheet of paper, and it's not feasible to carry around. And sometimes it's not even accepted as an acceptable form of photo identification because it doesn't have enough information to determine enrollment, or you have to pick up the phone and call the tribe and figure out if this person is actually an enrolled member. So just having or figuring out tools to kind of help de-escalate before it even escalates is the position and the movement that we're trying to move into.
Now, have you had a chance to? I know you've been communicating sort of with state level, and you've been talking about this sort of with members of the nation. But have you had a chance to raise these concerns with White House officials?
We have not met with the White House specifically. We have been working through the Department of Homeland Security. I know that everyone is in the middle of a transition as different political appointees are being transferred out and new leadership is coming in. I will say that the Department of Homeland Security has been very open to our concerns, and we do have ongoing discussions with them. Our last meeting with them was last Friday, and then this week we are meeting with them again to talk to the special agent in charge of the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency to relay these concerns and to start working on a way that we can bring in, again, some of that cultural training to these ICE officers so that they understand when they're entering these areas that have a mixed population, that they're doing so with the appropriate knowledge and the safeguards in place to prevent some sort of profiling from taking place. But we're also, again, taking that from our tribal members and making sure that they have the resources necessary and the tools that they need in order to get through the interaction without any issues. The nation also had instituted Operation Rainbow Bridge. It's a website that is now can be followed through the Office of the President, where people can report their encounters with immigration officials to the nation, and we can follow up on that as well.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, but thanks very much for joining us today.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Up next, we'll talk to APTN reporter Karen Pugliese about the Liberal leadership race and what role Indigenous issues and reconciliation is playing. Welcome back. The campaign to replace Justin Trudeau is underway, and Liberal Party members will select their next leader and the Prime Minister on March 9th. Two frontrunners in the contest are former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney and former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. But Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq MP Jaime Batiste is also running, as is former Liberal House Leader Karina Gould. APTN senior reporter Karen Pugliese is following the race closely, and she joins me in studio today. So welcome to Nation, Karen.
Thanks for having me.
I guess now the two candidates that were, of course, following Jaime closely, and you already talked to Karina Gould, they're a little bit of long shots and these things, so what do you think their motivations are for running?
Well, Jaime Batiste has been very straightforward that he's got really multiple reasons for wanting to run. I mean, first of all, he's role modeling. He said himself, somebody has to go first. Before there was a WAP canoe, there was an Elijah Harper, right? And so part of it is just role modeling that and trying to get youth involved and excited about politics. I think also when I was talking to him, he also really recognized that reconciliation and Indigenous issues have not been part of this, and he feels like he's bringing that. And he's also said, if I don't make it this time, I can always run again. He's in his 40s, he's still got like time left. He's, he's relatively young. I mean, compared to me, he's young. And then for Karina Gould, I pushed back on this a little bit with her. Is she in it to win it? Or is she in it as, because they also can be in it as kind of a strategy, right? When the ballots go and there's a first vote, a second vote, sometimes people drop out and they throw their support behind somebody else and ask them for concessions. Promise me you'll do this, and I will tell my supporters to go over to you. But she said she's in it to win it, and we can play a clip and listen to what she said.
So I think it's really important to have somebody who understands what millennials are going through and also understands what younger generations are going through. Like, it's hard to be a young person in Canada these days. Like, the cost of housing, the cost of groceries, getting a good job, like we don't have access to the same kind of long-term stability, pensions, benefits that, previous generations had. So it's a different time in Canadian politics. And I think it's a real bonus to have somebody who actually understands what people today are going through.
Now, just going back to Jaime for a minute, of course, that makes our job really interesting that he's entered the race. Now, I know that he will probably talk about reconciliation, Indigenous issues more than the other candidates, but I know he's been a big backer of Prime Minister Trudeau. Mm-hmm. Do you think at some point maybe he'll sort of differentiate himself in terms of reconciliation as to the soon-to-be former Prime Minister?
I think he's already trying to do that. When I talked to him about reconciliation, he really talked about, for him, it's about closing the gaps on water, which is kind of a Trudeau thing, but he also talked about housing. He talked about closing the gaps on child welfare, and we know the Trudeau government was really pushing back against the child welfare cases in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. So that's different. He talked about also climate and environment as being important to him. So it's this idea that I think all the candidates kind of have, that they have to sort of balance climate with business and economic opportunities. But he also talked about closing the gap on wealth and this tax on the rich, which I hadn't heard before, which I thought was interesting. And maybe I'll just let him say that in his own words.
There are 3,000 billionaires in this world, and they average less than 1% taxes because they shift to whichever country has lower taxation, where there's been a press in the G20 and to have a global tax that says that wherever you're from, wherever your revenues are being, that's where you'd be taxed on. The proceeds alone to that would help us tackle climate crisis in a real way, but also address some of the inequalities of poverty caused by climate crisis that we're going through. And
sort of moving back to these economic issues, both Carney and Freeland, of course, made economic reconciliation a really big part of their careers and before the leadership. Do you think we'll see a firm kind of vision from both of them before the campaign is over?
Well, I hope so. When we reached out to Chrystia Freeland's people, we said, well, if you can't give us an interview, can you give us some kind of priority area? And that's what they pointed out. They pointed out, like with Freeland, she's held like a lot of international posts, right? Like she was foreign affairs minister, et cetera. And so until she got to be finance minister, she wasn't really focused on Indigenous issues because she was focused on international trade and such. But the one that she did point out was the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program as something that was hers. I mean, that's the other thing. When she was finance minister, what ideas were hers and what ideas were Trudeau's? What happened behind closed doors at the cabinet table? So that's one that she's taking credit for, and that's really about finding a way for First Nations to be able to take loans for resource development. Because the Indian Act doesn't allow that, because land is held communally. If you're unsuccessful, the bank can't seize your land, right? So this gets around it by having the government guarantee those loans, and so it opened the door for economic expansion on First Nations. For Mark Carney, that was interesting. I've actually got some notes here because his people didn't really send anything. They sent a one-sentence statement. So I just kind of went digging into like his history and what he said before. And just last year, he spoke to the First Nations Major Project Coalition, which is an organization that represents about 144 First Nations that are interested in business and development. And he said there were three things that Indigenous people had a major role in Canada's future up to 2030. So one of them was clean electricity for the AI economy. You know, AI, what people don't realize is a huge energy suck. It's the same with Bitcoin. These things like just take so much energy. And so he's looking at a clean energy supply for that and believes that First Nations would be front and center in it. Also, the need of power and critical minerals. And critical mineral mining is important for electric vehicles as we move away from oil and gas. And then he said that First Nations inclusion would be critical to restoring nature. And he believes that 1/3 of Canada's 2030 emission goals can be reached through better forestry, land, and water practices. And so that's what he said then when he was addressing First Nations people. I would expect to see some of those things pop up in this platform.
Wow, so much to talk about in such a short campaign. Unfortunately, we'll have to end it there, and I need to let you get back onto the campaign trail to keep following these stories. But thanks so much for joining us today, Karen.
And thanks for having me, Fraser.
Late breaking news. After taping this interview, APTN News received a statement late Thursday afternoon from Jaime Batiste's campaign, confirming he is dropping out of the Liberal leadership campaign and endorsing Mark Carney. Good night.